B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Friday, September 28th, 2018. What's that Green Day song? Wake me up when September ends. The Kavanaugh confirmation saga, full of dirty deeds, done dirt cheap, is a clear indication that the Republican Party is completely infected with the Trump virus, as I will explain. So just about an hour ago, the committee took the vote, and it wasn't a real surprise. It ran completely on party lines. 10 Democrats voted against confirming Brett Kavanaugh, and 11 Republicans voted for confirming him. The committee sends the vote to the floor, but the action has an asterisk, because Jeff Flake, the retiring Arizona senator who lives up to his surname on a regular basis, well, he flaked out a little bit on the Republicans, because he extracted from Chairman Grassley what is described as a gentleman and gentlewoman's agreement. Will Mitch McConnell honor such an agreement? The deal is, Flake provided the key vote to report the nomination out of committee in exchange for an agreement to delay the Senate floor vote by 1 week to allow for an FBI investigation of allegations. Now, we don't know whose allegations this actually would cover, and a lot of this is very murky, as I report it to you at this hour, about 1:15 on Friday afternoon Pacific time. So this is interesting. It's a twist. But it's hard to believe that the Republicans will allow anything to get in the way of the bulldozer that they are using to place Brett Kavanaugh on the United States Supreme Court for life. So we will see how this plays out. It's a little bit encouraging that Flake didn't just fall into line completely. But Jeff Flake is a guy who says one thing and does another, and there are other Republicans like that. And as I said, we don't know if Mitch McConnell will honor the deal, because he seems hell-bent. He had a test vote scheduled for this weekend that would pave the way for the final vote on the Senate floor on Tuesday. Now, Flake's little maneuver caused Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska and Joe Manchin of West Virginia, a nominal Democrat, to join the call for a delay and an FBI investigation. Manchin, who desperately wants to vote for this flawed nominee in order to save his own sorry ass, quote, "The American people have been pulled apart by this entire spectacle. We need to take time to address these claims independently so that our country can have confidence in the outcome of this vote. Well, it is what is right and fair for Dr. Ford, Judge Kavanaugh, and the American people." Oh, Joe Manchin, you are so magnanimous. Trump has decided to stay out of the way of this little maneuver. He said the Senate should do what they think is right. He does stand by Kavanaugh, saying that he hadn't thought even a little bit about replacing him, but he also found Ford a credible witness. Now, how can you hold those two thoughts? They are contradictory. If Christine Blasey Ford was a credible witness, then Brett Kavanaugh lied his ass off in his his out-of-control performance on Thursday afternoon. We'll get to that in some detail in a moment. So it is in flux. It is clear that while this is all described as a scheme by the Democrats to smear Judge Kavanaugh, to delay, if not derail, his confirmation, some of that's true. Well, we're going to have to see how this plays out. But if I had to bet you $5 right now, it will be that these Republicans will use their raw power and the virus that Trump has infected them with, which means they can lie with impunity, because these are heavenly deceptions. That's what Reverend Moon used to call them, in service of a greater good. The power of the Republican Party to take America back generations, roll back Roe versus Wade and other critical progressive developments in this country? One other development is that Mark Judge, the critical witness who was not invited to testify yesterday, he said he doesn't want to testify. Now, I don't believe people get a choice in this. If you are a witness to something, you should come forward. After all, Christine Blasey Ford did. Anyway, Mark Judge says, he avoids public speaking. He struggles with depression and anxiety as a recovering alcoholic and cancer survivor. What a load of crap. I mean, I'm sorry. That is the lamest excuse I've heard in a long time for declining to tell what you know. Meanwhile, he issues these statements that are fuzzy, says he doesn't recall anything like this. And Kavanaugh seizes on that and misrepresents those claims as refutation of the assertions of Dr. Ford. So it is really mind-bending. There's no question about it. And look at this. The American Bar Association called for postponing a vote on the nomination. The dean of the Yale Law School, Kavanaugh's alma mater, that he bragged about yesterday, how he was proud that he got into Yale. The dean of the law school, Heather Gerken, quote, proceeding with the confirmation process without further investigation is not in the best interest of the court or our profession. And how about the Jesuits? I'm a Jesuit product. I graduated from a Jesuit high school in Cincinnati. And I experienced many of the same things, the preferential treatment of sports stars, the jocks. They were allowed to drink and get away with bad behavior. The rest of us were held to a different standard. Well, the Jesuit publication America, which had endorsed Judge Kavanaugh as one of their own, issued a statement saying the nomination is no longer in the best interests of the country. Quote, if Senate Republicans proceed with this nomination, they will be prioritizing policy aims over a woman's report of an assault. Were he to be confirmed without this allegation being firmly disproved, it would hang over his future decisions on the Supreme Court for decades and further divide the country. Now, in yesterday's podcast, I had to break after the morning session with Dr. Ford's testimony and the questioning of her by Rachel Mitchell, who turned out to be a pretty gentle gunslinger, brought in to protect the aging members of the Republican caucus and the Judiciary Committee from having to do the dirty work. But in the afternoon session, we're not sure what the script was, but Rachel Mitchell began to question Brett Kavanaugh, even asked him some questions that weren't helpful to his side of the story, like, what does brewskis mean? What does skis mean on your calendar? And at a certain point, Lindsey Graham, the senator from South Carolina, threw a little hissy fit with all this finger pointing and, his face was red. He gets all worked up. Says, what you want to do is destroy this guy's life, hold his seat open, and hope you win in 2020. This is the most unethical sham since I've been in politics, he said. No, actually, Lindsey, the most unethical was when you and Senate Republicans blocked even the limited consideration of Obama's last pick for the court, Merrick Garland. But, of course, that's, that doesn't have anything to do with what's going on now. And Graham is the poster child for the guy who used to talk honestly about Trump and his weaknesses. Back in 2016, he called him the world's biggest jackass, a race-baiting, xenophobic, religious bigot, and a kook. And now, he's just got the Trump disease from head to toe. And that's what we really saw exemplified in this ugly hearing, where Brett Kavanaugh was permitted to interrupt Democrats, to shout them down, to give them misleading answers, ignore their prompts for follow-ups. Big lies and misogyny are the two central elements of the Trump virus. You just tell a lie and you hang with it until it becomes the reality that enough of your supporters believe. And the misogyny is in broad daylight. How Trump can say that Ford was a credible witness, but of course he's been accused by women and they're all lying. And therefore, he can call her credible and embrace the denials of Brett Kavanaugh in the same breath without a hint of hypocrisy or contradiction. This is what we have descended to. This is the new normal. And it is so, so ugly. When Brett Kavanaugh, in his opening statement yesterday, and I didn't bring you that soundbite, I regret it, but he invoked how there's this whole conspiracy to bring him down, to ruin him and his family. And at the end of the list, he tagged on the Clintons. Now, I know there are a lot of Democratic operatives, some with links to Bill and Hillary and their campaigns, and Bill Clinton's administration, who have been actively opposing Brett Kavanaugh. But I honestly don't believe that they had anything to do with Christine Ford coming forward. And so far, I have no reason to believe that the woman from Yale or the woman from Washington, D.C. are part of any political operation. And so Brett Kavanaugh exhibited a total lack of judicial demeanor. He showed signs of paranoia, of buying into conspiracy theories. And while he projected his own innocence, his record as a judge shows that time and time again, he rejected the arguments of people who claim to be innocent or at least not guilty because he knows better. And the questioning by Democrats in 5-minute increments, it was very, very frustrating. It was clearly structured to limit any honest exposure of information. We already mentioned the lack of calling Mark Judge and other witnesses. This whole thing was constructed for a show. And they go through the motions of saying that Dr. Ford is credible, but they infantilize her. Sure, she was abused, she was assaulted by somebody, but it wasn't Brett Kavanaugh, and she doesn't even know where or when it happened. Therefore, we can ignore her, sweep away the issues, the obvious lies and misleading statements of Brett Kavanaugh about his drinking, about his other behavior. And some of those Democrats on the Senate committee are former prosecutors like Blumenthal from Connecticut. And he asked Kavanaugh about the Latin phrase falsus in omnibus. It's a jury instruction. And Kavanaugh said he knew about it, but he said, you explain it. And Blumenthal said, false in one thing, false in everything. Meaning in jury instructions, let's see, you tell the jury that they can disbelieve a witness if they find them false in one thing. And so the fact-checkers at the Washington Post analyzed the evasive commentary in response to questions offered by Brett Kavanaugh yesterday. And, for example, he issued the denial, "I have never attended a gathering like the one Dr. Ford describes in her allegation." And the fact-checker notes that we know that he attended parties like this, up to the point of the alleged assault, people hanging around drinking. And they point out that when Kavanaugh was in high school, it was not legal for him to drink until he became 18, and the year he became 18, Maryland law was raised to 21 for drinking. And so none of Brett Kavanaugh's drinking was actually legal. But he was permitted to say how much he loves beer, he used to love beer, he still loves beer. And I mentioned this yesterday, that Kavanaugh uses the statements of people who don't recall such an event as Dr. Ford described, like Mark Judge, like P.J. Smith, and he converts that to a refutation. They're saying they can't remember anything like this, and he says that means it never happened. But that's not what they said. Then there's the issue of deciphering some of his comments on his calendar and in the yearbook. And one of the references is to a devil's triangle. And go ahead and Google that. A devil's triangle is a ménage à trois, typically with 2 men and 1 female. But he was allowed to describe it as a drinking game. And apparently the senators don't know enough to challenge that. Then you have the case of Renata and the claim in the yearbook by Kavanaugh and many of his buds that they were Renata alumni. And he said, we just liked her a lot. She was a great girl and she was one of us. But here's the phrase in one of the classmates' yearbook entries. You need a date, and it's getting late, so don't hesitate to call Renate. Well, I have no information about whether this indicates that she was a sexual partner of all the people who claim to be part of this group, this club. But, these are obvious evasions. He is not being forthcoming, he's not being honest, and in some cases he is misleading or lying. And get this, he pushed back on Senator Amy Klobuchar, who asked him if he'd ever gotten drunk and blacked out, and he said, "Have you?" And she was too polite with him. She should have smacked him back and said, "I'm asking the questions here, Judge Kavanaugh." And when he was asked if he had or would take a lie detector test about this issue, he said, "Well, it's not admissible in federal court, but I'll do whatever the committee wants." Well, in a 2016 decision, authored by Brett Kavanaugh, as the government notes, law enforcement agencies use polygraphs to test the credibility of witnesses and criminal defendants. Those agencies also use polygraphs to screen applicants for security clearances, so they may be deemed suitable for work in critical law enforcement, defense, and intelligence collection roles. The government has satisfactorily explained how polygraph examinations serve law enforcement purposes. But not to Brett Kavanaugh. He is entitled to avoid a lie detector. Now, I have my own issues with polygraphs. But the point here is the way he is dodging the question. James Poniewozik opens his commentary piece in the New York Times today and gets it right. His first line, it came down to, she said, he screamed. And he did. And it was ugly. People on Facebook have taken screen captures of different facial expressions of Kavanaugh while he was testifying. Quite unattractive. And the New York Times says Kavanaugh wasn't believable. Here's one quote. Kavanaugh clumsily dodged a number of times when senators asked him about his drinking habits. When Klobuchar pressed him about whether he's ever blacked out, he at first wouldn't reply. I don't know, have you? A condescending and dismissive response to the legitimate exercise of a senator's duty. So now we come down to, do they have the votes? We have 2 wobbly Democrats, Manchin, who seems to be leaning no at this point, but that could be a head fake, and Heitkamp of North Dakota. Collins of Maine and Murkowski of Alaska are the Republican women who could still decide to reject the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh. And now we wait and see if there is a delay, if there is an investigation, and if any of that will change the outcome of this ugly, ugly process. Every day I pause for a minute to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. People like Andrew Harnack, Peter Hoffmeister, Jason Ferguson, and Janet Price. They each kick in $5 or $10 a month to support my work. Can you do it too? Will you? Come on over to peterbcollins.com. Find the menu button, pull it down, click on Become a Subscriber. You get onto the sign-up page, and your choices are easy. $5, $10, $20 a month. The $50 annual subscription can earn you our bonus CD, John Dist's American University. I'd love to send you a copy. And if you prefer to use the U.S. mail and avoid PayPal, my mailing address is Box 150, 660, San Rafael, California, 94915. Well, Facebook has more egg on its face. Book. Today, they admitted to an attack on its computer network that led to the exposure of information on nearly 50 million users. Facebook reports they discovered the breach earlier this week, finding that attackers had exploited a feature in their code that allowed them to take over user accounts. Facebook says they fixed the vulnerability and notified law enforcement officials. And this morning, more than 90 million Facebook users were required to log out of their accounts and log back in. Didn't happen to me, so I guess I'm not part of this hack. And Facebook said it didn't know the origin or identity of the attackers and has not fully assessed the scope of this attack. Now, earlier this week, we learned that if you use the two-stage authentication at Facebook, you give they ask you for your cell phone number. And I've refused to cough it up. I'm not that worried of being locked out of my Facebook account. It would not be, it might actually be a good thing. And so this is another exposure of risk to our data. And what we learned is that Facebook gives advertisers the phone numbers that users provide for two-factor authentication for use in targeting. Maybe that explains some of those junk telephone calls and voicemails you're getting on your cell phone these days. California passed a new data privacy law back in August, and it was one of these deals where big tech forced the legislature to kill an initiative and adopt legislation that is weaker than the language that was in the ballot measure that voters likely would have approved this November. And the guy who brought that ballot measure and who led the negotiations that led to the state law being passed and signed is Alistair McTaggart. I don't know him, but he's a San Francisco real estate investor. And he's got a lot of good ideas. He said tech has had zero regulation. For them, it's been this wild west of being able to monetize information any which way. They'll pull out all the stops to try to get back to where they were. So, in Washington right now, the tech giants are passing around money. They are lobbying hard for a federal bill that would preempt California's law. And if you haven't heard it already, check out my podcast with Mark Perchuk, who identifies this ugly process of preemption, where state and local laws are eviscerated by federal law, where local laws are eviscerated by state law. It is a growing trend and a problem for what's left of our democracy. So the Senate Commerce Committee held a hearing Wednesday. Amazon, Google, Apple, Twitter, AT&T, and Charter were there. Facebook is not listed as an attendee. And they are trying hard to pass legislation that would essentially nullify the regulations here in California. Today, I'm releasing to my subscribers a great interview with a powerful new voice. One of the things I try to do here is spotlight people who don't get traction in the mainstream media, who have important ideas and comments. And today, I spoke with Lyle Jeremy Rubin. He's a Marine veteran of Afghanistan. He is a doctoral student at Rochester University in history. He knows his history, and his political commentary really aligns with mine. His piece at The Nation last week is called The Forever War's Cheerleaders, and he warns that Russiagate and the Hillary Clinton campaign have morphed the Democratic Party into the number 2 war party, and he's very concerned about that. Here's an excerpt from my conversation with Lyle Jeremy Rubin.
You know, when Hillary Clinton was at the helm, that it was clear that most of my liberal and progressive friends and family members were willing to go wherever the Democratic Party was willing to go on questions of foreign policy. And Clinton at that point was teaming up more or less with the neoconservatives, people like Robert Kagan and Bill Kristol and David Frum, all these people that were in one way or another responsible for us getting into Iraq in the first place. she was teaming up with them not only to win the election. I mean, it wasn't just a matter of winning over more constituents, because the fact is there isn't a very large constituency for a kind of self-conscious neoconservative foreign policy. I think she was also teaming up with the neoconservatives because she shared a lot of policy goals with them. And I think a lot of the journalism, particularly from outlets like The Intercept and elsewhere, have kind of borne this out, that there has been a deliberate move on the part of Clinton and on the part of other the kind of right wing of the Democratic foreign policy establishment to kind of solidify a more long-term alliance with the neocons, and particularly in relation to Russia. I mean, I mentioned this in the piece, but there was an actual advocacy group that was established immediately after Trump won the presidency. And it was, if you look at the board members and everyone who's involved, it's a who's who of both Democratic Party foreign policy elites and Republican foreign policy elite.
I invite my subscribers to check out the full interview with Lyle Rubin. It's available today at peterbcollins.com, at iTunes, TuneIn, Spreaker, and Stitcher. And it'll be available without any restrictions in 14 days. The House Intelligence Committee voted today to release almost all of the transcripts of interviews that it's conducted as part of the Russiagate investigation. And there was some wrangling between Democrats and Republicans. Adam Schiff, who is really the guy who has surfaced as the top Democrat, and a guy who I don't trust when it comes to Russiagate, said that Republicans had rejected their effort to release all of the transcripts, and 5 of them critically, with James Comey, the former FBI director, former NSA director Rogers, former CIA director Brennan, and with good old director of national intelligence, former James Clapper, are being withheld, along with transcripts from interviews with Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Dana Rohrabacher, the California Republican congressman who is viewed as too close to Russia. So we may see these as soon as next week, but one of the other issues is the Democrats tried to refer all of their documents to the Mueller investigation, and the Republicans balked. A lot of people know who Elon Musk is. He is the founder of Tesla, and I give him a lot of credit for being an inventor and a guy who has developed a whole new concept for electric cars. He also runs a company called the Boring Company that drills, and I'm not really sure what's going on there. But Elon Musk is a guy who is controversial, and the Security and Exchanges Commission has just slammed him because a month ago he tweeted out a comment that he was thinking of taking Tesla private and that he had secured funding to do that. This led to a sharp increase in the stock price. And the Securities and Exchange Commission says this unjustified action, I'm sorry, that's Musk's defense. Let's start with that. This unjustified action by the SEC leaves me deeply saddened and disappointed. I've always taken action in the best interest of truth, transparency, and investors. But he's being accused of misleading investors with false public statements, and this is the first time a tweet has triggered that kind of a smackdown. I lament to report to you that the rogue utility that keeps the lights on here at the PBC secret studios, Pacific Gas and Electric, has done it again. They have used the state legislature the way they've used the State Public Utilities Commission in the past to foist their expenses and liability onto ratepayers. And it goes all the way back to the 1980s when they badly botched the construction of the twin reactors at Diablo Canyon near San Luis Obispo, and went to great lengths to saddle us, the ratepayers, with the cost of their errors. Now they're facing billions in lawsuits related to the wildfires in the wine country just a year ago, and they're going to get the ratepayers to help subsidize their bad behavior. This is really tragic, and Jerry Brown and the Democrats went along with it. They did water it down, and some of this involves issuing bonds, and then the ratepayers pay off the bonds. But this is an ugly, ugly scene. Because PG&E has been in bankruptcy before, and if these liabilities sent them into bankruptcy again, it's not that big a deal. That is the legitimate way to deal with these kinds of extraordinary expenses. But instead, backroom deals with a powerful utility and the politicians that it has greased for years. That's how it works here in the Golden State of California. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it far and wide. I remain your humble host, Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.